Well, no journalists outside of Gaza have been allowed by Israel to enter the enclave in the past year. So verifying information and getting human stories out of Gaza is hard. Ahead of the one-year anniversary today, I spoke to Arwa Damon. She is a former CNN journalist who has been able to travel to Gaza this past year through her work with the charity INARA. Here's our extended interview. Arwa Damon, it's been a year of war in Gaza. I know you've travelled there several times as part of your work with the charity INARA. You were there, I think, last in August. And look, as Palestinians mark what is a devastating 12 months that have killed so many people, rendered the vast majority of Gaza unlivable now. Just first of all, I wonder what your reflections are at this one-year point.
You know, it's been a year and it's still really hard to comprehend and even begin to articulate the sheer level of tragedy that Gazans are going through. And it eclipses just the physical destruction. You continue to see the psychological destruction of every single individual, even those that are trying to put on these extraordinary brave faces, mothers who are trying to hold it together for their surviving children who are unable to properly mourn their children who have been killed in all of this. You know, you see it in children who are trying to be strong and hold it together for their parents. And when you talk to people from Gaza, no matter what their age is, that spark of life that all of us have in their eyes, that's where you really begin to understand the depth and breadth of the sort of psychological crushing of Gazans, because that spark of life, it's gone. And the thing is the threats to them are relentless and daily. And there's no respite from it, not even for a minute, not for a single minute over the last year have Gazans really been able to just pause and take a breath.
And look, one thing that strikes me as we mark this 1 year and the toll it has taken on Gaza is that Palestinians sometimes are just numbers, aren't they? We talk about 41,000 people dead, but it is hard to kind of wrap your head around that figure, to quantify it, to put a human face on it. And, you know, given that you have worked there so often, you work quite a bit with children, I wonder what particular stories from Gaza stay with you.
You know, I met a little girl at one of the hospitals, and she had just come out of surgery. Her intestines had basically spilled out after a bomb blast, and she was in the care of her aunt. And her aunt had not yet had the heart to tell her that her parents were dead. I met a mother who came up to us with her little boy because she knew that we worked with children and that we also have a focus on mental health. And she said, you know, I don't know what to do about my son because every night he rocks back and forth and he screams and shrieks. And he's been like this ever since he saw his younger sister's head blown off. I remember the little children who are running around, you know, barefoot in open sewage right next to it. I remember the children who are covered in this horrific skin disease. It's called impetigo, and it basically, you know, causes these horrible blisters that then pus and ooze open and is very widespread across all of Gaza, who are in the hospital because they have especially severe cases of it. And normally the treatment for it would be so basic. It's, you know, you tell the parents, you know, wash the child twice a day with soap and apply this cream, only there's no soap or cream in Gaza. And so, you know, whenever I actually think about it and I start talking about it, I just have these, you know, images that flash in front of my mind of the faces of those who I've met. And what makes it even more tragic is that the need grows every day, and yet our ability as humanitarian organizations to actually provide for the people, it shrinks. We get more and more blocked as every single week goes by the Israelis.
And I do want to ask you in a moment about the particular challenges that your organization INARA faces. But, you know, you mentioned something so shocking there that actually families in Gaza don't even have soap. Just spell that out for us on the basics of humanitarian aid. Is medicine getting into Gaza? Is food getting in? What's happening right now?
It's all very sort of unnecessarily, almost deliberately obstructive and complex. A little bit of medicine does get in. Food does get in, but it's mostly on commercial trucks, which means that, in the southern part of Gaza, for example, you can go to the market and buy fresh vegetables, but most Gazans can't afford that. Some items are 25 times more expensive than they used to be. But what this means is that aid organizations like mine can go out and distribute fresh vegetable parcels. But the need is so big that obviously, no one can reach everybody. But then also in the southern part of Gaza, southern and central Gaza, while you do have these, fresh vegetables, you don't have soap. Soap is not really getting in. Sanitary kits, hygiene kits are not really getting in. Israel's not allowing them to get in. And then we also face the added challenge of when Israel does clear pallets, it clears them from a specific crossing point called Kerem Shalom. And Israel dictates to aid organizations which route we can use to go and pick those pallets up. The specific route that Israel designates for this has a chunk of it that is basically run rampant by criminal gangs and looters. And so we're not able to safely pick up these pallets if and when they are actually cleared. And Israel is not providing us, despite numerous requests, with either giving us an alternative route to use or somehow securing that one route that it is designating for our use. And so, yes, you end up with this almost absurd situation where, and this isn't just INARA, this is all aid organizations, can't even provide people with something as basic as a bar of soap.
Mm. And look, the world right now is so focused on what is happening in the Middle East, these Iranian strikes on Israel, the Israeli incursions which have begun now into the south of Lebanon. It is important to emphasize, though, Arwa, at the same time, the airstrikes on Gaza, the Israeli airstrikes, are very much still continuing. Tell us a bit then about how difficult in those circumstances it is for your organization, INARA, to keep working. I mean, what kind of risks are your staff facing to go out and do this job every day?
Well, anyone who's working in Gaza, anyone who's actually in Gaza is basically playing Russian roulette every single day because there is no safe space in Gaza. And even this so-called humanitarian zone is not a humanitarian zone by any stretch of the imagination. It's not a humanitarian zone because the conditions there are, simply put, inhumane, and it's not a humanitarian zone because it's not safe. There have been multiple strikes that have taken place on Massih, for example, on tented encampments on the beach that is an area that Israel specifically told people to go to because it is beachfront, because it is sand dunes, and as such, Hamas would not have dug tunnels underneath it. And yet we are still seeing Israel drop bombs on these areas that are leaving behind 9-meter craters. And so it's a risk every single day for every single resident of Gaza. And yes, for all aid organizations, including my team, to go out. And, when the evacuation orders came for some areas of Deir al-Balah back in August, INARA had team members that ended up having to evacuate. And then we also had some of the shelters that we work with whose residents had to evacuate, which obviously creates complete and total chaos because, again, it's this thing that, has been said since the beginning. Where do you actually evacuate to? The space in Gaza where civilians even exist has been shrinking while the number of civilians trying to survive in them has been growing exponentially.
Right. And I did want to ask you about displacement, actually, because the figures suggest at least 9 in 10 Gazans have now been displaced by this war, many of them more than once. You mentioned that your organization works on mental health as well. And can you speak to that? I mean, how are people coping with the trauma of the displacement, as well as, of course, these bombardments?
Well, and let's also be very clear that when we talk about mental health in this context, it's very basic because while the trauma is still ongoing and while the triggers are still there, you can't really begin to do the sort of deep kind of work that is actually needed. And so what it looks like, and we focus on children, is basically creating, activities for them, creating a distraction for them, trying to give them some tools to be able to cope with the constant fear that they're having to live with. And then yes, of course, there is the trauma of displacement, of losing that sense of security of home, not just once, but then multiple times. There's the trauma for a child of, looking towards their parents and realizing that your parents that are meant to be your pillars of strength and security can no longer provide you with that. And then, of course, there is the ongoing trauma of not having enough food, not having enough water, not being able to go to a proper bathroom, of being, subjected to numerous communicable, highly preventable diseases. In Nasser Hospital, for example, there are 2 children dying a week, according to the head of the pediatric department, from hepatitis A. And then, of course, on top of all of this, you have the bombings that are constant. And then even when the bombing sound is relatively far away, you have the drones that are buzzing overhead as if they're pervasively taunting the population with this, refrain of, oh, you think you've survived, but we still have our eye on you. We can still come get you.
I just want to ask you one final question, Arwa Damon. You're in Lebanon at the moment. Israel says the ground war there, which as we speak is just getting underway, will be limited, will be focused on Hezbollah. I wonder whether you see any parallels in the language, in the way the Lebanon campaign is being talked about now and how Gaza was talked about a year ago.
Well, you see parallels in how Israel says that it is carrying out, targeted operations and yet drops massive bombs that cause extreme civilian casualty. And this is, sort of especially seen in the Lebanon context because Israel has also actually carried out very precise strikes where they have hit a specific apartment within a building without bringing the whole building down. And the Lebanese are able to contrast that with strikes that have, leveled entire blocks and with what they have seen happening in Gaza. You see this in a lot of the rhetoric coming out of Israel that was to a certain degree similar to what we heard when Gaza first began. But then we also need to remember that the last time Israel said that it had Knesset approval to carry out a limited 10-kilometer incursion into Lebanon was back in 1982. And Ariel Sharon, who was the Minister of Defense back then, ended up all the way in Beirut, and Israel occupied back then Lebanon for nearly 20 years. And so many people here fear that they are going to suffer the same fate as Gaza with this widespread, horrible destruction taking place, that, Israel has plans to stay for an indefinite amount of time or to permanently displace the Lebanese population. And there is this pervasive fear of uncertainty that is even more amplified because remember, the Lebanese have been watching everything that has happened in Gaza. They know that Gazans have basically been live streaming their own slaughter, and that did not stop it from happening. And so they don't know what, if anything, is going to stop them from suffering the very same fate.
Arwa Damon, thank you so much. We recorded that interview last week with Arwa Damon.